afternoon. Welcome back to NALCAB's Economic Policy Summit. Thank you to everyone who has contributed to social media. Please remember our hashtag, Latino Economic Engine, if you'd like to comment on any of the topics that have been touched on today or that will be touched on. Up next, we are going to present a public policy panel led by NALCAB's Director of Public Policy, Clarinda Landeros. Clarinda leads NALCAB's public policy work and heads up our Washington, D.C. office. She is a seasoned public policy professional with more than a decade of legislative and policy experience. She has served as Legislative Director, Deputy Chief of Staff, and as Committee Staff in Congress. She holds a master's degree in public policy and administration from Northwestern University. In addition, Clarinda was a principal author of NALCAB's recently released Latino Economic Policy Agenda. Please welcome to the virtual stage, Clarinda Landeros.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for joining us for NALCAB's first ever virtual public policy summit, and in particular for this discussion. Today we are going to talk about an issue that is on everybody's minds, the economy. We are going to discuss the leading role of Latinos on the path to an economic recovery and how our public policies can help guarantee their success. We all want an economy that works for everyone. For decades, the American dream has embodied the idea that with hard work, anyone can buy a home, build assets, achieve financial security, and create a better homes for themselves and their families. However, we know that this notion is flawed, and this has been further highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic that has disproportionately negatively impacted Latinos, who are hard at work on the front lines performing essential jobs to keep Americans safe and healthy, and to keep our economy going. We all want a more just economy, and for the next hour, we are going to talk about how to achieve that. Today's conversation follows the launch of NALCAB's Latino Economic Policy Agenda, a comprehensive set of policy proposals that I had the privilege to co-author to boost the economic mobility of Latinos, and in doing so, help fuel our nation's economic recovery. By coming together, we can achieve better policy decisions so that we, our neighbors, our families, our friends, and others are not forced to make potentially harmful personal ones, such as choosing between paying the rent or protecting themselves from a deadly virus. With an election just days away, this discussion could not be timelier. I encourage all of you to engage in this conversation. We will have time at the end for questions that were previously submitted, although I do know that the chat on Facebook is working, so if you submit questions there, we will try to get to as many as we can at the end. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up. With that, I am truly excited to introduce to you our panelists. The links to their full bios are at the bottom of your screen and certainly on our website. They are very accomplished people that have done incredible things, and we are proud to have them with us for this discussion. I call them the dream team for a discussion on Latino economic policy. And if you do not already, by the end of our conversation, I am sure that you will see why. We have with us today Alfonso Morales. Alfonso is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is an expert in small business food systems, public marketplaces, and street vendors, particularly as they relate to economic opportunity. He has been published in the top journals of 6 disciplinary associations, and his work has been discussed in numerous national and international media outlets. We also have with us Barbara Robles. Barbara is recently retired from the Federal Reserve Board, where she was a principal economist in the Division of Consumer and Community Affairs. She has co-authored and authored publications on a range of issues, including Latino farm entrepreneurship in rural America, economic inclusion and financial education in diverse communities, and The Color of Wealth, the story behind the U.S. racial divide. She is currently engaged in research on a number of issues, including related to economic inclusion, including the gig economy and the Community Reinvestment Act, among other topics. We also have Jerry Porras. Jerry is the Lane Professor of Organizational Behavior Emeritus at Stanford University, as well as the co-director of Stanford's Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative and founder of the Latino Business Action Network, which works to empower Latino entrepreneurs to grow their businesses through research, education, and national ecosystem development. He is the co-author of an annual study on the state of Latino entrepreneurship in America, and recently authored a study on the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on Latino-owned businesses. Thank you to our panelists for joining this discussion. With that, I am going to turn it over to our panelists to give their 5-minute opening remarks centered around an answer to a question that is important to all of us, and that is, why do you believe right now it is particularly important to raise the profile of economic policy as it relates to Latinos? Let's begin with Alfonso, please.
Hello. Thank you very much, Clarinda. Thank you very much for the kind invitation NALCAB extended to me, and I'm very, very grateful to be part of a panel that includes such wonderful colleagues like Dr. Robles and Dr. Porras. I'm really pleased for the opportunity. So let me begin by saying that the problem of policy, that the use of policy is to release the creative energy of the public. Law and policy should stimulate the imagination of people in neighborhoods and communities, rural and urban, in order to assist them in finding ways forward in their lives, economically, socially, and otherwise. So policy must be designed to release the energy of the population. Now, in this regard, NALCAB and the organizations it represents are social impact organizations. We've called them nonprofits, but what we actually mean are that they are organizations designed and organized and staffed by extraordinary leadership that seeks to release the energy of the people they serve. So they have policies in place, organizational, in order to, by their own activities, translate opportunities from state and federal policy to translate those broad opportunities into specific opportunities in communities and neighborhoods. So when I think about policy, I think about it in that framework. How it is that we create a space and open relationship opportunities that both translate federal and state policy into organizational environments and then diffuse those opportunities throughout communities. So it seems to me that at this time, one of the things that we need are policies that bridge both profit-oriented business of the sort that the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative serves, and social impact organizations, many of which have joined this call today. I think we must support them in seeing each other in reciprocal relationship, not just in terms of financial support for impact organizations, but as a part of a larger ecology of economic activity, opportunity, and support across the communities. And in this regard, I think it's important to speak specifically about the interests of communities of color, generally speaking. In almost every instance, Latino organizations will be operating in organizational environments that are inclusive of other organizations. Relationship and bridge building for mutually advantageous goals is very important here. So no matter what the state or federal policy is, it is important to try and identify local relationships that can produce impacts, and I think that will be enabled when social impact organizations and the business sector share positive relationships and find alignment in their goals and activities. So I believe that it's particularly important to raise the profile of economic policy as with respect to Latinos for the general purpose of advancing an agenda that makes policy generative of opportunity. And in this regard, the specific and important thing is aligning activities and goals across sectors in order to enable the opportunities to be realized in specific organizations and for specific neighborhoods and communities. I'd be happy to elaborate on details in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfonso. With that, I'll turn it over to Barbara Robles. Again.
Thank you, Clarinda. I wanted to also echo my colleague, Alfonso Morales at the University of Wisconsin in thanking NALCAB and in thanking the board of directors at NALCAB that represent such a large, geography of the United States with respect to the Latino community. NALCAB submitted a really significant and important Latino economic agenda. And I want to wholeheartedly support it because I think everything that it points to is exactly the kinds of issues that we need to bring to the table. However, I'm going to focus on three things that I think are really crucial and really essential to not only the Latino community right now during the pandemic process, but looking ahead to the next 10 years and what's coming down the pike. So the very first thing that I'd like to talk about is the digital divide. One of the biggest issues that we've got right now is that we're moving into a time where internet connectivity is equivalent to what electricity was during the Great Depression. Our youth, our adults, and our aging population all need interconnectivity, as this pandemic has revealed, for a variety of different reasons. For the youth, we need to really be thinking about their educational opportunities and making sure that that pipeline doesn't get interrupted. For the adults, many of whom need the remote work, many cannot do the remote work, but they still need that connectivity in order to be able to start up their own kind of self-employment opportunities and independent contracting opportunities, and connectivity is really significant and important. For the elder population, this has been a pandemic that has really, brought home a lot of our cultural traditions about familia. And one of the things that we need to do is to do a cost-benefit analysis of being near, but also being able to check in, and telehealth and telecommunications with nursing homes and our elder population is really significant. Now, having said all of that, I want to bring attention to another issue that we're going to be dealing with, and it's not going to go away. It's going to get bigger. I was lucky enough when I was at the Federal Reserve Board to have administered an exploratory survey on what we called the enterprising online and offline informal work market. And one of the things that we found was that the gig work that everyone tends to focus on with respect to Uber and Airbnb and Lyft is actually much, much broader than those markets indicate. In fact, gig work has been going on for a long time in our community, and it's now gotten the kind of attention that it needs to be getting. And this includes home health care that's going to be growing tremendously, along with day laborers, along with a lot of other startup and independent contract work. So the gig economy is going to get bigger. It's going to include self-employment, independent contracting, and all of the different kinds of supplemental work that's needed when variable hours for your typical job is moving up and down like a roller coaster. Finally, I'm going to echo what my colleague Alfonso was talking about, which is the notion of public, third sector, or the nonprofit community organizations and private partnerships. Moving ahead, we're going to need all three of these actors to actually be engaged in all the communities in order for us to begin to recognize how significant and important those three actors are going to be to market creation, in other words, market making, innovation, sustainability, given climate change, given a degree of different kinds of impact factors on communities. And if we do not have the kind of partnership, what I would call the triple partnership that's required, our communities are going to suffer with respect to the kind of organic leadership that is so significant in our communities. I would say that one of the biggest issues that we're going to be dealing with in the future is the public education of our youth and our communities with respect to leadership and governance. And that includes having an understanding of what the government and how the government works for you. But it also is about what you owe your communities. It's about the Latino giving back that we all grow up with. It's about how can we make our communities better? How can we make our familias better? And this is something that I think really kind of focuses in on, in my opinion, is finances over the life cycle and tax education. For me, I have been a spokesperson for tax education for the past 25 years. And I see tax education as a form of wealth insurance. People who understand their tax obligations are able to hold on to their wealth. And wealth inequalities are growing bigger and more rapidly, and we need to be at our best in order to keep that from regressing and getting worse and moving forward with sustainability issues. So I'm glad to take any questions later on, but those are the biggest factors that I see impacting the Latino community, and our voices need to be raised to address them. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I do hope that we have time to dig into, you raised very important issues there a little bit later. Jerry, to you now for your thoughts on why is it particularly important now to raise the profile of economic policy as it relates to Latinos?
Well, thank you, Clarinda. I'd like to also echo my thanks to NALCAB for inviting me to participate in this event. It's really a lot of fun for me to be together with Alfonso and Barbara again. I'd like to tap into kind of one of the last points that Barbara was making and use it as a kickoff for really explaining what our thinking has been about in our efforts to try to improve the life of Latinos in the United States. See, in my mind, the most pressing problem facing Latinos communities in this country today is really the lack of wealth. And I believe that the quickest way to deal with this problem is to increase the number and success of Latino entrepreneurs. So I'd like to give you a little background on how I and others around me here at Stanford came to hold this view. First of all, we think wealth is really having two components, income and net worth. In 2018, the median total income for Latinos was about $51,000 a year. This is compared to $71,000 for whites. And then also a median net worth for Latinos was about $21,000 compared to $171,000 for whites. So you can see that these are really substantial gaps in these two components of wealth. So with such low levels of both income and net worth, Latinos can't consume much beyond subsistence. They can't afford decent housing. They can't promote decent schools in their communities. They can't send their kids to college. They can't get decent health care, and on and on. Now, if we raise this individual level analysis to the level of the national economy, historically, about 70% of the US GDP is driven by individual consumption. So, what's the impact on the US economy when Latinos don't consume at the same levels as the rest of the population? Well, at present, we make up about 18% of the total population. Our impact on the US economy is felt, but it doesn't severely limit the success of the economy as a whole. But what happens when we are 30% of the population, which will be the case in the next few decades? In this future scenario, unless Latinos consume way beyond subsistence and more closely match everyone else, the US economy will be at a greater risk. So for the sake of the country as a whole, action must be taken to steadily increase the wealth of Latinos and ensure that we are able to consume at the levels necessary to continually stimulate the growth of the US economy. So for me then, the bottom line is the economic success of this country is dependent on the economic success of Latinos. And the economic success of Latinos is dependent on increasing their ability to create wealth for themselves and their communities. Now, these seem like obvious statements, I think. But when we look at it more closely, a classical way that wealth is generated in our country is for people to get a college education, go to work for a corporation, climb up the management ranks, earn bigger salaries, and create wealth for themselves and their families. Unfortunately, this doesn't work well for Latinos. We don't get very far up the corporate ladder. Latinos make up 17% of the US workforce, yet only make up 8% of all managerial positions and 4% of all C-suite executives. In fact, there are only 10 Latino CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. So the traditional corporate ladder is not the most effective way for Latinos to generate wealth today. So we asked ourselves, what might be faster? We believe that the answer is entrepreneurism. And fortunately for us, Latinos love to start companies. In a recent national survey, when asked if they would like to start a business, 47% of Latinos said yes, compared to 27% for whites. Now, these opinions have been translated into behavior by Latinos, so that over the last decade and a half, Latinos have started companies at the rate of about 1 million net new businesses every 5 years, to a current overall total of about 5 million. These new businesses are not all taquerias or gardening services or cleaning services or beauty salons, as is commonly thought about when someone says Latino businesses, but they're businesses in all industries and in all parts of the country. And these new businesses are growing, and they're hiring at least one employee. In fact, in 2018, the growth rate for the number of Latino businesses with at least one employee was greater than the national average in over 80% of the states. So currently, the 5 million US Latino-owned businesses generate about $800 billion per year and employ around 28 million people. So that's the good news, if there is any good news. The bad news is that although Latino businesses are growing rapidly in numbers, overall they are not growing as rapidly in annual revenues. Today, approximately 3% of all Latino-owned businesses are scaled. That is that they have annual revenues of over $1 million a year. This is compared to 9% for white-owned businesses. If we consider all Latino businesses, not just scaled ones, we find that if the average Latino-owned business's annual revenues were the same as the average white-owned businesses, the difference to the US economy would be about $2 trillion per year. So if we could just get the average business, Latino-owned business, up at the size of the average white-owned business, the difference to the economy would be $2 trillion per year. These perspectives define a significant challenge we as Latinos face. How can we grow our Latino-owned businesses so that we can increase the wealth of Latinos to the level of others, and in doing that, help the entire country to grow and prosper. Now you notice I'm taking the approach of helping the country to grow and prosper, and it's an economically based approach. I think that that's the most powerful way to drive change and drive improvements in the Latino communities and to create the policies that are needed to improve the state of Latinos in this country. But at Stanford, for us, the answer was to create the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, or SLAE. It's a collaboration between the Latino Business Action Network, or LBAN, and the Stanford Graduate School of Business. At SLAE, we focus on 3 sets of actions. One is we want to do research on the barriers to growth faced by Latino-owned businesses. And we hope that this research and the results of the research begin to inform policy at all levels, state, local governments, as well as the federal level, and also policies that businesses follow in their relationships with Latino-owned businesses. Second, we offer educational programs that will teach Latino business owners how to grow their companies. And third, we build an ecosystem to help Latino-owned businesses grow. Our goal is to dramatically increase the number of large Latino-owned businesses, that is, companies with $100 million, $500 million, and $1 billion in revenues. Now, we focus on this goal for 2 major reasons. Large companies substantially influence the political, economic, and social environments of this country. A lot of the differences gets made, a lot of the changes that are made are driven by large companies. And they have not been equally represented by Latinos, so that the Latino perspective is not introduced into those policies. It's not introduced into the economic approaches. It's not introduced into the way the society sees Latinos. And then the second reason is that large Latino-owned companies can pull up the smaller ones by doing business with them and by being role models, showing that it is possible to become really big. So it makes a lot of sense for us to help Latinos create large companies if we really want to make a difference in our communities. This is an overview of our efforts to date. I look forward to providing any additional detail that you may ask for, and I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. On the issue of strengthening Latinos and opportunities for Latinos, a question that I wanted to ask all of you is recently, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said that the pandemic has revealed deep inequalities that were already pervasive in the U.S. economy. That the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing disparities in our economy that were already troubling. Do you agree with that? And if it has, how so? In what ways do we see those inequalities and disparities? Alfonso, do we want to start with you?
Sure. I'll give it a try. So, no, I think the legacy of discrimination in the country has made for, on the one hand, the possibility of niche economies in which firms could take root, grow, and hold a place in their local communities. However, they weren't able to scale up, which is, I think, something Jerry was speaking to right there. On the other hand, those disparities often created the conditions where the only way to earn income to support a family was through what we might call the unregulated economy, what Barbara was referring to in the gig economy, or what some people call the informal economy. Being outside of the national accounting and being outside of typical credit reduces the opportunity to take loans that would make for business formation and growth. And so that limit exacerbates the inequalities that existed. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that people in either side were not successful. No, they were often important in their community, the small grocer, the small taqueria person, so this isn't, none of us are saying that. Instead, what we're saying is that the ecosystem that Jerry's referring to is one that has much room in it for population by Latina-owned firms that work across sectors, and as Barbara indicated, between social impact and private sector, in order to produce broader opportunities that in fact feed the overall economy.
Barbara, the question that I had actually in listening to Alfonso talk about this was the gig economy. This has come up a couple times now. Could you give us a little bit more explanation on what you mean when you say the gig economy?
So,
what are we referring to?
okay. So the gig economy is kind of taken off in terms of it being a new, kind of area of research that is basically driven by the internet platform startups. And it's been a focus mostly of researchers, especially economists, looking only at companies like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb. All of these are, they're great startups. I don't have anything, disparaging to say about them other than there's some problems with worker misclassification issues, but that's another story. The gig economy, the way that we explored it in our survey was we wanted to look at how it was that we could deconstruct stereotypes of minority populations not wanting to do hard work. So we opened it up and we looked at informal enterprising activities. And we wanted to get at everything everybody was doing in order to bring home some form of monetary compensation to the family. So we were looking at things like yard work, dog walking, house cleaning, babysitting, tutoring, lecturing, everything, the whole 9 yards. And in that space, we also asked the question, do you want to start a business of your own? And if you do, why? And one of the issues that we kept hearing over and over again was, I don't have opportunities for advancement in my regular job. So what I want to be doing is looking to own my own business and create opportunities, not just for myself, but for my family and my community. And we were getting a lot of that response, bigger than what people had anticipated. And so if you're only looking at internet platform economies, you're not going to get as big and as wide a response as if you were saying, we want to look and explore online and offline. And so to echo, both Jerry and Alfonso's comments, I think the entrepreneurial spirit of the Latino community is real and strong and is not going to go away. But we need to find new ways of researching these data gaps that exist that keep perpetuating stereotypes that are about deficits for our community as opposed to the real reality that we're asset builders. And we're an amazing asset for the country because we've been part of the infrastructure of building the country. And I would say Jerry's right on target that without us, the future doesn't look real promising. So we need to do a better job of that.
Thank
and
you.
I'll let Jerry take over.
Jerry, do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed deep inequities in our economy that have been pervasive for a long time?
Well, I think so. Clearly, the pandemic affected both Latino business and non-Latino businesses pretty severely. And so in some short surveys we did in March and then again in June and again in August, it's clear that the impact was severe. And 70-80% of the individuals felt that they were severely impacted. So everybody was hurt. And then the PPP program gets introduced as a way to, resolve some of the hurt, reduce it anyway, and that was made available to large quantities of dollars. So this was supposed to then be accessible by all types of businesses, and what we found was that in fact the accessibility to those funds by Latino-owned businesses was substantially lower in terms of success than it was for white-owned businesses. We found that somewhere on the order of 12% of Latino-owned businesses were successful in acquiring the money that they had requested in the PPP loans. And this was compared to something like 28% of white-owned businesses. So white-owned businesses were substantially more successful. Now, one of the sort of benefits of part of the work that we're doing that really speaks to what is possible if we have an ecosystem out there that supports Latino businesses is what happened to the SLAE education alumni that come out of our program. We have like over 650 alumni now, and over 500 of them are connected together on a platform called Mobilize. And they interact with each other, but they also interact with the LBAN staff. And the LBAN staff during the PPP situation was very active in providing information and data on what's going on, how to apply. This bank is making it difficult, that bank makes it easy. This CDIF is really accessible, this one isn't. And so that information that was shared by LBAN, but also shared by the participants themselves. What I would see on Mobilize, for example, that one person posted, hey, I just applied to PayPal and I got my loan in 24 hours. And then a few hours later, a day later, 6 or 7 people posted, hey, I applied to PayPal and I got mine too. Or a CDIF in Colorado, which happens to be owned by one of our alumni, wound up funding around 16 of our alumni in their PPP loan fund requests. So that network, that supportive collaborative network, really made a huge difference. And it turned out that 82% of the people in our alumni base that applied for PPP got loans. So a huge difference, a huge difference. And it was all because of this information sharing, the supportiveness that's going on. Now, Latino businesses don't have that. And that's one thing we need to promote and support. And this is where policymaking can really begin to influence and more tend to structure that more into the society. And right now, it's something that we're trying to promote as part of our efforts.
That brings me to the question that I want to make sure we have time to get into, because you were all touching on it a little bit, and that is, and Barbara, you did a little bit with the digital divide, is looking at the economic environment and looking at where Latinos are and Latino small businesses. What are the gaps in policy? What needs to be? And I know we could talk about this forever, but the top priority, of yours that you think, policy changes that can be made to help both Latinos and Latino small businesses in the current state of the economy.
Alfonso, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Sure. So I'm thinking about that in two forms, right? In my opening remarks, I talked about policy with kind of a small p associated with organizations. So I think that the audience that's listening to this conversation has said to themselves, wow, every organization NALCAB works with should borrow or adopt the platform that SLAE is using to help establish local network of Latino business that can be mutually supportive of each other across their supply chains, both within their supply chains and between their supply chains. I think that's so that's a small piece sort of policy thought, right? And frankly, I would be very supportive of that. And I found, I think that what is doing very, very in this regard. And when I think about big P policy, it's hard. There are so many agencies in the federal government that have so many different ways forward, right? So, for instance, there's the Community Reinvestment Act that I think that Barbara might speak to a little bit and might have a call to action for folks on. I think that the U.S. Department of Agriculture provides so little support for Latino food owned and operated farms and businesses. That's just it would be with a little increase in funding, they can make a big difference. So I think the the Bureau of the Census, I think they do a pretty good job collecting data on sort of typical. For instance, the COVID Pulse survey that's in households around the country is not oversampling Latinos. And yet, good policy at the neighborhood level can only follow from appropriate and sufficient data collection devices. I'm a scientist, okay? And I believe in the power of science, but not solely the power of science. I think that the entrepreneurial initiatives, whether they're in business or in the social impact sector, are both very important. They're both very important. And that gut feeling that the entrepreneur has to advance things is very important. However, again, in the absence of good data, it's hard to make policy suggestions, whether they're local, state, or federal. Let me be quiet for a second and let my colleagues, because we're all PhDs. We can talk for hours.
So
Barbara, do you want to answer?
To basically say, there are two policies that I think are crucial for managing wealth inequalities in the Latino population. And the first one is, yes, I will do the call to respond. We have 3 regulators that are in charge of the Community Reinvestment Act on banking services, and that includes the small business and farm lending, as well as mortgages and credit and all other types of services for minority communities. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is in charge of the big banks. That's about 1,200 banks in the U.S. The FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that came out during the Great Depression, is basically an insurance of our savings and our deposits, et cetera. And they're in charge of the CRA for about 3,000 banks, a little over 3,000. And the Federal Reserve Board is in charge of community and rural banks, and those are about 900. And they just modernized their Community Reinvestment Act regulatory policy. Each one of these regulators can actually have their own CRA, Community Reinvestment Act regulatory policy updates. And OCC already has done theirs. The Federal Reserve Board has theirs up on the Federal Register. And I urge everyone to make comments on that, because the 2 issues in modernization that's going to have an impact on the Latino community is going to be the digital divide and the third-party vendors that are basically supporting the rural smaller banks because they don't have the bandwidth to go online to be doing a whole bunch of the different kinds of services that are required of their communities. So I urge folks to visit the Federal Register and to leave their comments. So
And
the policy.
Oh, pardon me for interrupting. The Community Reinvestment Act is the law that requires banks to invest in their communities.
All communities. Yes, serve all communities in which they are located and in which they serve. So it's basically the anti-redlining regulation from Congress that came out of the 1970s. The other really important issue for Latino communities in terms of wealth erosion, and that we have done a very poor job of regulating and that needs to be addressed, has to do with inherited property that ends up being auctioned off because of tax lien sales. Every state worries about their revenue source on property taxes, and that is where we lose our biggest wealth impact from inheritances and whole equity properties. I'm not talking about mortgage foreclosures. I'm talking about tax liens because we don't have an understanding of our tax obligation. So those are my two bugaboos that I think are really important to deal with the wealth divide in the Latino community.
Great. Jerry,
Yeah.
on to you.
Yeah. Yeah, from my perspective, focusing on businesses, the biggest issue is really the loan patterns from banks. Our most recent research is now collecting data from 3,500 Latino-owned businesses and 3,500 white-owned businesses, and asking a whole series of questions about a lot of things. But one of the areas is clearly financing. You know, where do you get the money to finance your business, to finance your growth? And I can't share the data right now because the report's going to come out in January, but broadly speaking, the experiences of Latino-owned businesses in securing loans is very, very poor in relationship to white-owned businesses in securing loans. And this is controlling for a lot of factors which are supposedly used as parts of the decisions that are made by banks as to whether to give a loan or not to a particular business. So holding those things fairly constant, Latino-owned businesses still are in relationship to white-owned business are not getting loans at the same level. So what that says to me is that the regulation process, the measurement process, is not adequate. The new bills, whatever they are, I haven't seen them, and who they're supposed to come from, they're just not adequate. They're not looking down in the weeds and seeing that you have two businesses and they both seem to be pretty much the same, except one is run by someone named Jones, one is run by someone named Gonzalez, and the Gonzalez one tends not to get the loan as frequently as the Jones one does. So there are things going on, and those things need to be dealt with, and clearly self-regulation is not going to do it. It's just not going to do it. And you get down at the very lowest level of the bank manager making a decision about a loan, they're looking for other things, and self-regulation is not going to be a big factor in that. I think there has to be some governmental policy that really scrutinizes this area, because this can make a huge difference then for the ability of Latino businesses to grow, because you cannot grow without money. And if you can't get money, you're kind of dead in the waters. And other things like venture capital, et cetera, do not apply to most Latino businesses. They're mainly focused on high tech. And although there are a growing number of Latino businesses there, the bulk are not in high tech area. So VC money is not very readily available, and other fancy types of money. So Latinos turn to what? They turn to their own credit cards. They turn to mortgaging their houses. They turn to high interest sorts of loans that risk them personally much more than the white-owned business, than the white business owner. So they put their own economic future much more at risk by where they go out and get money than happens for the white-owned business. So those other areas are much more difficult to regulate, but we certainly can do a lot, I think, to really make sure that banks are being equal in their granting of loans to Latino businesses.
Great, thank you. I want to make sure we have time to get to some of the questions that were submitted from audience participants. And one is related for everybody. The COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected Latinas, who often take on leading roles in childcare and schooling at home. How will this economic downturn affect Latinas long term, and what can we do to support them? Or what needs to be done to support them?
This is a
Alfonso,
really Sure. No, I mean, I've written a little bit about gender role relations in household business formation for women. So I've done some research about this over the years, and pre-COVID, it has been the case that frequently Latinas have a variety of negotiations that they have to do within their household before they're able to engage in negotiations outside their household and forming a business or seeking outside employment. And So it is true that in COVID, women are suffering disproportionately economically due to the changes in workforce participation and due to the changes in the public sector and education. So it's one of those situations where I don't want to sound like purely bad news, that we're going to have to redo a lot of relational things within house in order to secure a way forward. Instead, I think it's incumbent on our social impact organizations and on men to stop and work through the implications that COVID has had for not just them and their immediate families, but for their spouses in particular. And I know that this might be that this is going to vary by household formation, right? By the household composition, whether it's two Latinas or so. So in any case, whatever the household composition, there has to be sensitivity within the household with respect to what has happened and how to take whatever changes in the household that have happened and trying to turn them into resources. That if one has lost her job or is back to the double or triple day from when her children were preschool age, if they have to return to those ways of thinking, then what is it in those in those activities, where is it did they find some latitude and some opportunity to develop themselves, even in those difficult days? We have to try and find ways for, even in this period of time, to convey resources to those women to prepare them for the time when they can rejoin the workforce or rejoin the entrepreneurial opportunities in their communities, maybe reinvigorated in some way and supported in a greater way by a household, by a spouse who is more cognizant of the problems that they faced and more ready to support them going forward. Sorry for the long answer.
Well, and what kind of resources? You said make sure that they are aware of the resources available. What Can you give me an example of what resources those would be?
So I think that those would come from impact organizations like the ones NALCAB works with. How is it that those organizations can take some of their programming and adapt it? Right now, there's in many of those organizations, they have entrepreneurship programming that may be delivered by a particular face-to-face modality. That going to be ways, I think, to establish that programming in a way that's more adaptable to this current situation. Maybe through recorded Zoom that a person can see in their off time, right? And broken up into segments that are more easily consumed by people who are otherwise very, very busy. Now, I know that that's small p organizational policy, but in part, that recognizes the reality of the absence of a vision from federal government and state government. Now, it's conceivable that local government has resources and is sensitive to and has relationships with NALCAB organizations or other organizations to make these opportunities available in local spaces. But that won't always be the case. So folks have to take the important assets that they are as impact organizations and think through relationships with members of their community to enable them to go forward. Hope that makes sense.
It does. It does. Jerry, Barbara, do you want to weigh in on this?
I would just echo what Alfonso's already said, but I will say this: one of the problems that we have, especially on the border, and I would say in other dense areas with the Latino population, is we have the multifamily issue. And that in and of itself, even as you're helping, you're also creating the problems of the cluster contagion. So we're living through really experimental times. We need to try everything that can work. And I wholeheartedly agree with Alfonso about community organizations being resources.
Yeah, I do too. I don't have much to add. I mean, it's really a challenge. You can't go in and legislate how a family is run internally. So
Yeah.
so how do you begin to change the culture of a family and a lot of families to accommodate for these new sets of responsibilities that women have in running a business and now having to run it from home and having to continue to take care of all of the things that are going on with the kids, et cetera. So it's a real challenge, and I wish there was an easy answer that I could come up with, but I can't. I can just tell you it is a severe problem, and our data show that that women were very severely impacted. Now, not all women run businesses that you can run online. So that means that if a huge percent of your business has to be face to face and you can't do it, that makes it even more challenging. So it's a really complex problem. It's exacerbated by the situation of the traditional role model or the role of a woman in a Latino family, and there needs to be evolution in those families, and how you get that evolution is not an easy answer.
No.
This conversation is flown by. We're down to just a couple minutes, but for those watching that have heard what we've said about changes that need to be made, the policies that maybe aren't supporting Latinos or Latino businesses as well as they should be, what can we tell them? How can they be involved? What can they do? Any remarks on the person who's watching is thinking, wow, what can I do to help? What can I do? I know, Barbara, you mentioned the Community Reinvestment Act. That's a great example. Responding to that regulatory call to action, like you said. What else can people do that want to help?
So I guess since I've kind of gone first all the time, so I'm just going to go ahead. In a word, I think we have to remember perspective, and in a few words, perspective and process. Okay, so insofar, many people are suffering, and they're worrying about just making ends meet. Now, it's very hard to tell somebody think your life while you're trying to run money for groceries for the week ahead or pay a bill.
Yeah.
But when people who are listening to this, when you're in the position where you can stop and reflect on your perspective and to try and bring that perspective into greater alignment with the perspective of your loved ones, the perspective of other folks, and reconcile the differences in those perspectives, and then seek mutually advantageous goals and restructure one's life a little in order to try and advance toward those goals, I think we have the makings of a way forward in households. Now, with respect to, for instance, or small p policy in organizations, I think it's very important to remember that we see the world not as the world is, but as we see it. As we see it. And so oftentimes the habits that we have about our organizational activities and roles that we play really do need rethinking. And so I think that here is a time for people to think about the organizational activities they're engaged in and how they might be reconfigured a little in order to assist folks in going forward in the context that we have.
So
Sorry for talking so much.
I'm gonna say just one thing real quick, but I'm gonna kind of pitch SLE, the Stanford Latino Entrepreneurship Initiative, at a local level. I think that the organizations that are involved with NALCAB should be working with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and get local surveys out. And they can use the one that is, basically take a page off of the one that's already up and running at Stanford and use that as a template. But we need more data.
Yeah, I would support that. I think we do need that. Are we running out of time?
Yes, I'm sorry. We could talk for hours about this, but we need to wrap it up. Alfonso, Barbara, Jerry, what a pleasure and honor it has been to have this conversation with you. I hope we can have another one in the future. And to those of you watching, we certainly hope this conversation has been informative, but most importantly, that it has inspired you to act, to promote policies for a more just economy that works for everyone. And on the topic of taking action, it is my pleasure to introduce the final speaker, Arturo Vargas, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Association for Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, also known as NALEO. NALEO is a leader in the cause for a more equitable economy for Latinos and promotes the participation of Latinos in the American political process from citizenship to public service. With Arturo Vargas at the helm, NALEO has raised awareness for the importance of the 2020 census, the Latino vote, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Latino families. Join me in welcoming Arturo Vargas to the virtual stage.
The NALEO Educational Fund is the nation's leading Latino civic engagement organization. Our mission is to make sure that Latinos have a full voice in American democracy. I'm Arturo Vargas. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the NALEO Educational Fund. For over 25 years, this organization has been helping Latinos participate in American democracy, helping Latino legal permanent residents become U.S. citizens, become voters, encouraging people who have lost faith in our political system to vote for the first time and to keep voting in every election, helping those Latinas and Latinos who get elected to office to be the best city council members, mayors, state legislators that they can possibly be. We want to make sure that Latinos have a full voice in American democracy. That's our mission, that's our vision, and that's what we work for every day.
Hello? Hello. Thank you for having me join your summit. I'm Arturo Vargas with the NALEO Educational Fund. I'm going to share with you a quick slideshow on, and I am pulling up my clicker, to share with you what's happening with the elections in 2000. I have a call to action for all of us today. Let me talk a little bit about Latinos in the election. There we go. Excellent. This is the current landscape for Latino participation. We are now a week away from the end of voting. November 3rd is election day, but election has already started. And this is an indication of the pattern we have seen for Latino voters over the past some 20 years for presidential elections. There are 3 lines here I really would like to bring to your attention. That top blue line, that represents the number of Latino eligible voters, meaning there are Latino U.S. citizen adults who generally would be eligible to vote. That middle line represents Latino registered voters, and the bottom line, actual Latino voters. You can see that the story has been that as every single presidential election proceeds, there is a historic number of Latino voters. But we are still not achieving our full potential in terms of Latino voter turnout among eligible voters. The story here is that if we register Latinos to vote, they will turn out to vote. So removing barriers to registration, making voter registration more streamlined and accessible is what will increase Latino voter turnout in every single election. Going back to the 2016 election, this is what we saw. We saw a historic number of Latino voters, 12.7 million cast ballots, that was a 13% increase over 2012. There were a number of milestones that were achieved in 2016, the election of the first Latina to the United States Senate, the first Dominican American in the House, and the first Puerto Rican from Florida. But let me talk a little bit about the midterm elections, because something very important happened in 2018. Here again, you see those three lines. The top line, the number of Latino eligible voters, or eligible to vote because they're adult U.S. citizens. That middle line, registration, and that bottom line is also actually turned out. Now, in midterm elections, historically for everybody, there is a smaller turnout in midterm elections than in presidential elections. And we saw that in 2018. Trying to advance my slide. There we go. In 2018, we still had a record number of voters, 11.7 million Latinos cast ballots. That was a 73% increase over 2014. 11.7 in 2018. Remember that 2016 number? That was 12.7. Only a million figure difference between the two. So let me point out two states to show what happened in 2018 that set that midterm election apart from all other midterm elections. Here's California and Texas. Here you see that pattern of a presidential election with a high voter turnout, and then it dips significantly for a midterm. Back up for a presidential, down for a midterm. 2016, back up for a presidential election, but look what happened in 2018. There was virtually no drop-off in the number of Latino voters in that midterm election compared to the previous presidential election. The last time we saw this in a midterm election was in 1994 in California, when we had Proposition 187 on the ballot. Here were some of the milestones from 2018 that we saw, both at in Congress and statewide. So this impact that we had at down ballot races helped propel these kinds of victories that we saw that Latino candidates had in 2018. So what does 2020 look like in terms of the turnout? Again, our projection, let me go back. Our projection is that 14.6 million Latinos will vote in 2016, another historic increase. This is a 15% turnout increase from 2016. We consider this the floor, the minimum number of Latinos who will vote in 2020. Now, we still have not finished the voter registration period. There are some states that allow voter registration still, and some even on election day. And this is how that vote breaks out by the states with the largest number of Latino eligible voters. Again, nationally, about 14.6 million Latinos at least expected to vote. Take a look at some of these other states and their projected increases in turnout. California is looking at a 20% increase over its previous presidential election. Look at Colorado, Florida, Nevada at 22%, North Carolina at 23% increase over the last election. You see the states with the largest number of Latino voters are California, Florida, New York, and Texas. But even these states with a smaller number of electorates, they make up a significant share of the voters in their states, and they could make the difference in a statewide election, including some of these state U.S. Senate contests. We know that the control of the Senate may change from one political party to the other, and these are some of the Senate races that could decide future control of the Senate in each of these states, in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina. Latino voters are a significant share of the electorate that they could make the difference in these Senate contests. We looked at gubernatorial contests as well in terms of governor's races that are in play. And there is one governor's race happening in 2020 where Latinos can make a difference, and that's again in North Carolina with the re-election of Dan Forrest. Look what happened in the last election, it was a 0.2% difference, with Latinos now well over 3% of the electorate, and the share of voters in North Carolina. In a contested race like that, they could easily make the difference. But as we go into 2020, as the previous panel talked about COVID-19, that will significantly affect Latino voter performance, we believe. There are 5 concerns that we have of how COVID-19 will be affecting the Latino electorate's performance in this election, potentially. One is, we know that Latinos have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Registration, again, an extremely important element in ensuring an increase in Latino voter turnout. We need to get Latinos registered to vote. But over the past several months, many of the agencies that provide that voter registration experience were closed. Department of Motor Vehicle agencies, for example. So that voter registration option was closed, which again goes back to my point about streamlining voter registration, making it more accessible, making it online. Voter enthusiasm. We know that there has been an impact by the stresses caused in COVID-19 in civic participation. We saw it in the 2020 census. Millions of Latinos were quarantined, although millions were working because they're essential workers, but still participation rates in the census in heavily Latino areas was not as high as we would have liked to have seen. And we're concerned that this COVID circumstances may have a similar impact on voting, which makes our turnout and voter engagement strategies all the more important. Misinformation. There is significant evidence that there are efforts to suppress the Latino vote by mischaracterizing the issues in this election. We have seen this extensively in Florida in particular. So we're monitoring this very closely, and we're working closely with some of the social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter to make sure that Latinos are provided with accurate information about this election. And then voting options is another significant concern in this particular election. Many of us will be voting by mail. Many of us voting by mail for the first time. Historically, Latinos are less likely to vote by mail than non-Latinos. So for Latinos especially, many of them will be first-time vote by mail voters. And that is not always an easy process. Some states have different rules of how you vote by mail, how many envelopes you have to return, what goes in which envelope, where do you sign. All of this has consequences as to whether or not your vote will be counted if you don't complete your ballot correctly. So voter education will be particularly important in this election. Still, we know that Latinos prefer to vote in person, so we want to make sure that Latinos feel safe and secure in that in-person voting experience. Let me advance my slide. So one of the things that we're doing at NALEO is that we've been having a weekly tracking poll. For the 9 weeks leading up to the election, we have been speaking and surveying 400 Latino registered voters, tracking their voter preferences, their candidate preferences, the issues they care about in this election, how they intend to vote. And then as current events have affected the campaign, we've asked them about these issues. We're now in week 8 of this poll, and by the end of this project, we will have surveyed nearly 3,700 Latino registered voters. And we're learning that, in fact, Latinos are very enthusiastic about this election. Contrary to our concerns we had about COVID, it seems the issues in this election are really motivating Latinos to participate. They're more enthusiastic in 2020, they tell us, than in 2016. In addition, in the release of our survey that we had today, the evidence shows that 1/3 of Latinos have already voted. They have voted early, either in person or by mail. And what is driving Latino turnout in terms of issues in this election is the pandemic. Consistently over the past 8 weeks, the Latino registered voters in this survey have said that the COVID-19 pandemic and how candidates respond to it is the number one issue they're considering as they go vote. This is followed by access to health care, which is very related to the pandemic, and then followed by the economy and jobs, and then followed by the need for immigration reform. And fifth on the list of a top priority is institutional racism and the issues that have been raised by the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer and related developments that we have seen. In terms of how we're preparing for this election, the NALEO Educational Fund is part of the National Voter Protection Coalition. We run the Spanish language arm of the hotlines for voter information and voter protection. Our number is 888 Ve y Vota. Anybody can call that line and receive information about where to register to vote, where to locate their polling location, how to vote, and if in the days leading up to this election day or on election day itself, if anybody encounters any problems in voting, if people are told they're not registered to vote, they can't vote, and they're denied a provisional ballot, if they're told that they have the wrong ID, any issues whatsoever, we're encouraging Latino voters to call this number. We are working very closely with an army of lawyers across the country so that we can respond in real time and ensure that no one is denied the opportunity to vote and to cast a ballot in this election. We all need to work together to ensure that everybody who is eligible to vote participates in this election. You know, I am not a fan of saying that any election is the most important election of our lifetime, because I believe all elections are important. But I think it's a consensus that this may be the most consequential election of our lifetime, and we need to be engaged. It takes everybody getting involved in ensuring that Latinos have a full voice. We're doing what we can at the NALEO Educational Fund, but all of you participating in the summit, not only do we need you to vote, to make sure that everybody in your networks also engage in this election. So thank you for allowing me to share some data with you and some thoughts on Latinos in election 2020.
Thank you so much, Arturo. And thank you all for joining us for NALCAB's inaugural Latino Economic Policy Summit. As a reminder, NALCAB National Training kicks off tonight with a virtual networking reception. All of today's attendees are invited to join us. We'll see you back here at 3 p.m. Central Time. Thanks again. And on behalf of NALCAB, this is Sharon Garcia signing off. Juntos somos más.